a lot of writers, especially back in the 60s, were fighting World War II in space.
Right.
And then you got
Right.
into the 70s and 80s and they were fighting Vietnam in space. That's one thing that, you know, you have to take into account. Even if you want to write Vietnam in space, you're gonna have to come, if to not insult your reader's intelligence, you have to come up with a good reason why. How come all these technologies we have now are not at work in your Vietnam in space? How come there's no
100%.
weaponized drones? How come there's
Yeah.
no satellites giving you constant feed of what's being? You have to at least explain that, even if you wanted to go that route.
Troopers fall through an endless sky. Military sound and science fiction contest. We enter the system on fire. Military sound and science fiction contest. Told stories every Wednesday. Military sound and fiction podcast.
Today, we're talking about what military science fiction writers get wrong. And this could be by get wrong. Well, we should actually throw that out as a question. For me, get wrong means typically I want to throw the book across the room. I get frustrated with a writer because people are making dumb decisions, or I just stop reading. Like, I'm too busy at this point to push through on a book that I just don't like. But, well, that's too broad a question, actually, is to say, what do people get wrong? Because that's what we're talking about. So why don't we start with the biggest things that irritate each of us, and then we'll move to smaller things. And maybe like an example from the last book that you just stopped reading. I don't know. Josh, you want to start?
I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything recent. And I don't know that I have like a really good example of this, but I know that I've seen it several times. And sometimes it's not as glaring a mistake or even poorly written as others. But it's where there's something happening, whether it's a battle or just a contest of wills or something, and the way that the good guys or the protagonists get through that isn't because of their skill or talent. It's the ineptitude of the bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
And it's what I like to call the easy button, where you put your characters in a situation and maybe you hadn't completely thought about how to get them out of it, and so you just nuke the planet from orbit because it's the only way to make sure. And
That was easy.
Right.
yeah.
Why don't we do this every
and
time?
you move on?
Yeah.
Right. And I think also that tends to be the reason why a lot of books get like the boring parts drawn out. I know we talked about, I think maybe it was on a different podcast, I was talking about the murky middle and how a lot of people get kind of lost in there. And I think that's a big reason, especially in MIL sci-fi today, is that the author puts their characters in a situation that they don't know how to get them out of it, or they don't have like the tactical background or experience to come up with a good way to get the characters out of it. And so they just hit an easy button and the battle's done, or the whatever they were dealing with at the time is done and they move on. Whereas if you would have just taken some time, done some research, maybe read different books, and got a kind of like a library of skills and means, you could have come up with a really interesting plot item that would showcase not only your skills as a writer, but the skills of the character and how they get through the situation. And a lot of times not hitting the easy button will add, 3 or 4 or 5 chapters in which they're dealing with this problem. And, I know that there's some sequences and sections in books that aren't as important as others. So I'm not saying that this is like the end all be all thing. Sometimes that the solution is just something very simple. But something like a a gun battle where you're pinned down and the easy button is you call in air support and they come and just kind of obliterate the enemy and they get picked up by the transport and get flown out. That to me, a lot of times that comes off as easy button, where there could have been some more dramatic tension. There could have been some character development there. And
See, my first example was going to be kind of the exact opposite.
ooh, yeah.
Not the last one. I mean, not the whole thing, but that last point is that too many military science fiction authors seem to forget that air support is a thing.
Yeah.
Everybody
Yeah,
wants to
okay.
do like guys shooting in the trenches, but
Combined
nobody ever
arms.
thinks like, yeah, that we can call in artillery and call in air support. If you're not going to do that, you have to mention why you can't.
For
Why
sure.
that? Why the air support's not there? That's a big thing. I make sure I do in like Drop Trooper or other novels where there's a war, is that they mention like, do we have air support? It's like, no, they're tied up with the enemy fighters or enemy assault shuttles or whatever. And somebody makes a joke like, yeah, the air support has always been theoretical or something like that. You have to like remember that this isn't just your squad doing some A-team style crap.
Right. Certainly, unless you've set things up. But yeah, you're right. That's forgetting, or really that's where somebody who only has a certain type of military experience, or just thinks that, well, SF is super cool, so I want to write about operators.
I
Well,
just
even
watched it
operators,
on TV or something.
yeah. I mean, even they don't work in a vacuum. They got to get where they're going. They need logistical support. They need other types of support. For me, and it's one of my just favorite sayings from the military in general, is that the enemy is not stupid. The enemy may not have the same resources you do. You may not believe what the
Sometimes the
enemy.
enemy's stupid.
Sometimes, I mean, sometimes they're stupid, but you also got to look at like, okay, what's their background? What's their level of education? Like in the moment of the thing that they're doing and the level of training they have, they are mostly rational actors, or would be, there. I went to I had to do security on a talk once where some guy was actually arguing in I won't say in favor of the Taliban, but he said something that like the Taliban have legitimate grievances. And I was like, what? I had just never thought about the Taliban that way. I still don't think they have legitimate grievances, but it led me to think like, okay, well, what are their grievances then? And what leads them to like, what is the foundational element of what they're doing, and how does this lead them to make the decisions they make? And I think doing that kind of thought into your enemy, and even if the enemy doesn't have, like, look at all the rear echelon attacks that say Iraq made during the initial invasion. Like they, we were all rah, we're kicking ass because we rolled across Iraq, and then, oh, whoops, now we've got all these, rear echelon people attacking our supply lines in the background. And
I'm not sure it was that organized.
it wasn't, well, it wasn't, and it certainly could have been more effective, but it was, I mean, they killed people. And that is a thing that I think, at least in the briefs that I received, nobody was talking about that. So I think that's always something to consider. And one of the things that I like, I hate it in general when a story is hiding anything. Like I want to see the characters doing the thing the story promises. I don't like there to be, like, for me, an easy button is usually about withheld information. And we as authors know it's probably because the author didn't think through what that answer is, and then it just occurred to them how they're going to do it. But if a well laid out story, I mean, every military operation has some kind of plan. The plan may change, but the characters are following the plan and responding to the plan. And if they meet resistance and win through it, like that's the kind of thing that I get really excited about. It's when there's some kind of, Deus Ex Machina or easy button or nuclear weapon that makes all that effort seem futile, or like, why did we even do that? That really frustrates me.
That's another thing that you've got to explain in your book. And this is another mistake I see military science fiction writers make all the time, is why are you not bombarding the planet with asteroids? Why are you not nuking it? What makes this planet worth preserving intact? And that has to be a plot point. You can't ignore that. You can't go in there and just say, oh, we're dropping in because this is how we do things, because this is Vietnam in space,
Right.
You have to make a point why it's important that you go in here and take this place with boots on the ground. Like in several of my books, is because there are civilian hostages, and if you sacrifice them, then that's going to be bad press for you, and your president's going to get impeached, and your government's going to fall. I mean, seriously, if you sacrifice hundreds of thousands of civilians, sometimes millions, just to win a battle, that's something that would get the government kicked out. It's not something that could be ignored or swept under the rug.
I think on the same, I've got some examples of some good examples of how making the enemy not dumb. I've got some examples that, but I wanted to touch on really quickly in the same vein of making your enemies dumb and having to make dumb mistakes. I've seen where the author makes the main character make dumb mistakes, or like you're saying, they purposefully keep the information from them by some means or whatever, and so information that they might have had or they could have had if they had done some, like, I don't know, tactical recon or something like that, right? Like they keep that information hidden, or another character knows it, they don't sell it for some reason, and things go to hell, and but also that the main character might just do something that's really dumb, like, I don't know, something happens and he just goes into a rage that's completely uncharacteristic, and because he's going into this rage and he's got all this bloodlust, he runs out on the field and he kills a whole bunch of people and he gets his team wiped out. Stuff like that are just, it's unnecessary if that's not the point of your book. If it's just kind of a way to cause some tension, there's much better ways to do that. And a couple of the examples of that I have found, and this kind of goes, we were talking beforehand about topics of the show, and talking about reading books that kind of build your writer war chest, if you will, with experience, is Mark Greaney writes the Gray Man books, and they're not military science fiction, they're modern day military spy thriller. But the thing about his books and his characters is that he, for the most part, every single one of the antagonists in his books, and typically there's like at least one or two that are coming at things from different angles, they are just as smart, just as capable, and just as highly skilled and trained as the Gray Man himself. And it's not like James Bond going into a room of henchmen that are just, bodies to the grinder type thing where he can plow through a whole bunch of them. The majority of the time, the people that the Gray Man goes up against are peers, and he can outsmart them, sure, and a lot of times he does, but it takes a lot more effort to write those scenes, because he can't just spin around a corner and surprise a guy because they're expecting him there. Like there's several sections in the books where you think, oh yeah, he's got a great idea, no one's ever going to see this coming, and then the enemy is smart enough to put the pieces together and go, this is most likely what he's going to do, we are going to counter this. And so now not only are you reading to see if Gentry can pull it off, but you're also reading because that the enemy is going to counter whatever he's trying to do, and it really
Right.
pushes the story really
Matches
well.
up the tension and makes you really
Yeah.
root for the character. It's a little bit of
Yeah.
a slog if the all they're doing is mowing down wheat. Like, okay, that's now we just get to see the same thing over and over again, which is,
Yeah.
folks might
It worked
finish.
for Arnold Schwarzenegger.
What's that?
It worked for Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah. Well, I think
Yeah.
that's a good point, because a lot of like Rambo, and I mean, when I think back to these sort of,
Commando.
subliminal things in my mind about how this sort of battle works, that sometimes is the thing you got to get past. Like that might be your first impulse, and then you'll be like, no, this isn't good, and fix it, because it's not. It might get you through that scene, but it's not doing anything to make the story interesting or different.
I think a key point in that vein is whether your story is only told from one point of view. Because if you're telling a multi-point of view story with some of them from the enemy, then it can work to make the enemy smart, because you're going inside the enemy. You have a compelling villain or antagonist who's having these really interesting, strategic and tactical revelations. But if you're doing a first person point of view from some grunt on the line, he's not going to know any of that. And all he's going to know about the enemy is, they're attacking us here, and maybe he'll hear what they did afterwards. But I don't know that it's as a manageable say strategy, I guess, for writing the novel if you don't have some insight into the point of view of the enemy.
Well, and I think too that like you mentioned Rambo, and I know at some point our Aliens review episode is gonna go live, which I thought was a really fun episode. But I think from like a writer point of view, in terms of writing a military fiction novel, like a lot of us are the same age. We all remember the same type of movies. We've all, for the most part, read the same books, or most of the same books. A lot of our experience, I believe, and resource comes from like movies like Aliens, like you mentioned Rambo, The Terminator, like all of these, like for us, classic movies that we've watched over and over and over and over again, that have really kind of they were the baseline for our writing. And there was a time, and I think it's still valid now, where a lot of people were basing all of their war novels off of World War II, even if they were far future in the future, or even Vietnam.
Something else I want to get into.
And I think that I think Jeff would probably argue this if he was here, but a lot of I hear a lot of the advice from authors are to read the classics, like read the sci-fi books that were big and all of this, and everybody says if you're going to write fantasy, read the Lord of the Rings. Well, I think sometimes people take that to like the nth degree and don't consider all of the new current upcoming books that are out that really kind of change the paradigm, and they are coming up with new ideas. And obviously there's new technology, and they're a lot of these writers that I think are making kind of hindering themselves almost, is they're reading the classics, they're remembering these movies from the 80s and 90s, and they're basing a lot of their writing and their stories and their plot structure on those books without taking into account it's 2024 now. It's 40 years after some of these books, and
that's the thing, like you said, a lot of writers, especially back in the 60s, were fighting World War II in space.
Right.
And then you got into the 70s and 80s, and they were fighting Vietnam in space.
Right.
And that's one thing that you have to take into account. Even if you want to write Vietnam in space, you're gonna have to to not insult your reader's intelligence, you have to come up with a good reason why. How come all these technologies we have now are not at work in your Vietnam in space? How come there's no
100%
weaponized drones? How come there's no satellites giving you constant feed of what's being? You have to at least explain that, even if you wanted to go that route.
Well, and I think that's one of the biggest reasons. What I like to recommend is people that want to write mil sci-fi today, read the current modern day fiction,
or even read nonfiction about
that too.
TWOT.
read present day current events, and either fiction or nonfiction, because I think you would be surprised if you haven't read those to see what the technology actually is present day. Because there's
read up on the freaking Ukraine war and see what they're doing.
Yeah, there's just so many
science
more
fiction.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's so many more technological advances that are around right now.
Imagine thermals in Vietnam. Like,
oh my
that would,
God.
Agent Orange, like everything. And this gets back to choices, right? But you think about, if we had thermal technology in Vietnam, would we have dumped so much Agent Orange on the country?
No.
And Agent Orange was like a huge, tactical impact as far as how we're going to use it, how effective it actually is.
Well, it's like the X-27 night vision now. The X27 night vision now is like the most modern advanced night vision system the special operators
I
wear.
mean, compared to
And
what I
it's
had when I was in the infantry, we had night vision. It
Yeah.
was a joke
It was
compared to what they have
terrible.
now.
Yeah. What they
well,
have now is amazing.
you know, even the quad tube ones are outdated now because the
Yeah.
ones that the most high tech ones they're
I had the
using
single
can
tube.
present the night vision in almost color. Like
Mm.
it's crazy how clear
Well,
that
they
the night
also have,
vision
I
is.
believe that the new ones they have on that XM7 rifle, I think it's
Yeah.
called. They're like computer graphics too. So they take and they'll make things even clearer than they would be if you were just looking at it with your eyes. It's
Right.
how advanced they are. And that's the stuff you have to. I mean, I had that in my science fiction a few years back before this, and I thought this is really advanced. And now, no, this we have it. It's now.
Yep.
I think though, I think the not doing that kind of falls into the realm of easy button in a way, because if you have, let's like I extrapolate and weaponize that people are not going to need external devices. A lot of that's going to be implanted. Like their eyes are just going to be able to change filters, like, you know, night vision or thermal or whatever it is, or some combined version of that. And so if you do something like that, where you've got these really advanced observation equipment and technology, you have to figure out a way to counter that. And so it takes in my experience, it takes some time to figure out how am I going to counter that. And if you don't want to figure out how you're going to counter it, the easy button option is, well, just don't put it in there. Maybe their night vision doesn't work, or that it's not an advanced, or it's just like the PV and sevens, right? Or the is that right? PVS?
PVS7.
and PVS sevens.
Yeah.
But
It just
you could go with something, that's hand wavium in a way, but it's at least it shows you thought of it. Say
Right.
that there's some kind of EM interference, some kind of jamming that makes all your other sensors not work, and maybe they have some kind of technology that I can't imagine right now that would make thermal sites not work, that
well,
would
that I mean,
blow-
that's
scramble them
I
again.
did that
But
in
it shows you
weaponized
thought of it. It shows you thought of it at least.
in
With
this scene that I'm
escalation-
writing. I just
Go ahead.
Good.
go ahead, James. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, with escalation, like so many of these technologies, we have them because I shouldn't, folks that we're fighting don't fight at night, and we do. And that's why we have this tech, so that's always, if everybody has it, then you lose that tactical advantage, and maybe we just don't do that anymore. So it's a waste of resources.
Right.
But
That's the thing that you have to I make a point of, is that when like Marines in my books land on a planet at night, it's like night, day, doesn't make any difference. You're sealed in your helmet, and everything you see is filtered through a computer combination of all the different sensors you have, put in a picture that makes sense to you. It won't make any difference if it's night or day anymore, or bad
Yeah.
weather or good. It's
Mhm.
just
Well, to your point, Rick, like the scene that I just finished working on yesterday, or I put kind of the finishing touches on, was a scene in which this guy wanted to conceal himself against sight or any type of observation devices. So he pops off these two, I call them dazzlers, but it gives off a really bright energy signature, but also puts smoke into the air. But in the smoke, there are these little particles that have been developed that they will counteract any kind of observation. So it basically blinds everything.
That's
But
cool.
what I didn't, and this goes back to reading modern fiction, what I didn't know until recently, and I thought this was amazing, and I put this in my book too, is that there is fabric now that is called adversarial patterned fabric. And if you wear this fabric, facial recognition cameras cannot lock on and identify your face. So, and you can Google it right now, adversarial fabric. They're just weird, crazy patterns that if you're wearing it, any camera that sees you cannot identify your face. It can't record it.
Interesting.
And that's right now. And so
Yeah.
I've incorporated that Of course, in my book, it's not like a weird fabric design. It's just the fabric and it does it. But
I
that's
like
something
that
that I
thing
didn't even
with
know
the
existed.
I have done this was like I put this out back like 20 years ago, but I had a thing where the vehicles, the combat vehicles, had these smoke generators that
Yeah.
would put out smoke with like electrically charged chaff inside of it, like little tiny
Mhm.
particles, nanoparticles that would blind any thermal or electromagnetic based sensor like radar. And that's something that, I mean, also lasers probably wouldn't work through it either.
Yeah.
I mean, but you know where the thing is in general because there's a big smoke cloud. But you know, you can't like from orbit shoot like a thin dart, you know, from orbit like the kinetic energy weapons at it because you don't know exactly where it is.
Right.
I thought that was a good way to get around the whole why aren't they just shooting at them from orbit thing.
Well, it comes to like basically just a very basic concept of cover and concealment, right? Of generating your own concealment, no matter what that technology happens to be. If it is, a hire that uses, some kind of ingrained nanotech or built-in EM, or maybe it is just smoke, right? But the concept is still the same. And I think a character who's looking at things, or a knowledgeable character who's thinking about these, like, okay, maybe I don't have this resource, but I can do this, and as part of your world building, you can walk through that. It's when the characters don't think about those things. To me, that kind of gets that line we've talked about before between, what is military SF versus characters in maybe a space opera setting who are fighting a battle. Like a military character, a soldier, a well-trained soldier is thinking about these things. And maybe I just need to create concealment, or cover, but what tools do I have to do that? And I think that's what really ratchets
Well,
up that realism.
and I think
And
that applies both. I mean, I know we've talked about a lot of like small tactics and like infantry tactics and stuff, but I think that applies to like if your character is going to be some kind of pilot, either a fighter pilot or a shuttle pilot or something. If you don't if you don't put in the work to know what a pilot is going through when they're flying, especially in a combat mission, um that's not going to come off realistic, right? Like even talking to just present day pilots, you will be able to get a feel of how they feel in the cockpit and what they do. And a lot of those tactics are going to be the same. The feelings are going to be the same. The biochemical reactions, all of that stuff is going to be the same. And making sure to get not only the reactions right, but their thought process about what they're thinking about when they're doing it. Like, in a tactical situation, somebody's thinking about, are you in a combat crouch? Where's my gear? Do I have all the things that I need? How fast am I going? Where are my buddies at? Um, you know, I think one of the things that I've seen, it's not necessarily wrong, but it's not showing the skill at which these people would operate by doing what they do. But like, say you're clearing a house or you're doing like mount operations and you're having the platoon sergeant like order his guys around. That works in kind of like a regular infantry scenario, but if you're writing like special forces, they don't need to do that. Like, they all intuitively just know what they're doing. They don't have to tell each other, go here, go here. That all that stuff's already done. They've trained it so many times that they don't need to tell their partner what they're doing. All they got to do is tap them on the shoulder or squeeze their arm, or they just know. And I get that some of it is done for the benefit of the reader, because the reader might not, understand intuitively what they're doing. But I think overdoing that is often a mistake in terms of stage direction, and a lot of that stuff can just be shown rather than going through and go, I've got one target here, or move to the
Mhm.
left, 3 buildings and come up this way. Like, a lot of people are just going to know. Even like combat infantry veterans are going to know that. They're not going to be able to they're not going to have to be told, go here to get cover or go here to get a better shot. They're just going to know.
Well, that's one of those places where, like Rick was talking about, multiple POVs really benefits from this sort of thing, because then you can jump between characters and see what each one is thinking about and show different parts of the battle, through their
Yeah.
perspectives, which I think enriches that. So one thing I wanted to touch back on when it comes to talking about the enemy and books that are less satisfying for me is I like the bad guy to be bad guys. Like I can understand, like it's fine to understand their perspective, but I don't like to. One of the things that's less satisfying for me is when I'm reading a book that I'm reading for entertainment, and like okay, it's okay to sympathize with the bad guy to a certain extent, but I want them to be bad guys. I don't, that's not as entertaining to me, or I feel like there's some movement in a lot of recent stories to make the whole argument of being a soldier like kind of like morally gray. Um, and I always lose a little bit of sympathy for soldiers that are just there for the soldiering, right? Like, I don't care who I'm fighting for. I just want to kill people. Um, I like it when they have a cause they're fighting for. I like it when they believe in their country. I like it when, um, they, they fall back on their values. I like that. I don't like it when
Yeah.
the enemy is not it's just less satisfying for me, I guess. Like it feels like a lot of recent stories we're just afraid to make the bad guys bad. And that's
I
something
mean,
that
if you look at a lot of history, though, there's not, particularly prior to World War II, there was a lot of wars where both sides are kind of like morally equivalent to each other.
sure. Well, I mean, I get that.
I mean,
And I
like,
think what I meant to mention that was I think that's why World War II stories are as appealing as they are, and Vietnam stories are kind of a downer. Because you don't have that moral high ground, which if you're writing an entertaining story, for me, like I kind of like to have that. Maybe it's not a complete showstopper. It's just not as um it's not as like lose myself in the entertainment piece of it. I realize other people can feel differently, but that's the thing that I've noticed a lot of.
Well, kind of on the same vein, I feel like sometimes you go too far in the other direction. And I'm not saying like just making them evil for the sake of evil, but let's just say they are bad guys. But on the same vein of not making them stupid, if you've got a bad guy command, like a bad guy squad, like to say you have two special forces squads and they're like going against each other, right? The antagonist is, more often than not, they're all kind of just meat at the grinder type. But I would rather see an antagonist squad where the squad leader is smart and capable, and then he decides, I'm not just going to throw my guys, I'm not going to send them down this hall because they're going to get cut up by gunfire. Like we've got to figure out a better way around this. And then you're kind of attacking the same problem from two different sides, where when you're writing it, you're trying to figure out the best way for the protagonist to approach the problem. But conversely, you need to figure out the best way for the enemy to approach the problem, and have both of those reasons be logical and reasonable. And then, like I said, it just takes work to figure out how to get the good guys to win. And I get that there are some situations where the good guys aren't going to win, and that's important too. If the good guys fail on a mission, or they lose somebody, or whatever it is, like that's important too. But I always, if I'm going to kill off a character, especially more in my recent books, but if I'm going to kill off a character and it's part of, let's just say, the main character's team, I like to have a reason for that. And it doesn't have to be that the character is like doing some last stand on the bridge to hold everybody back. I just like to have a logical reason for why the character is going to die, instead of just killing off a character. There's a character in Weaponized that I kill off in book 2, and there's no like courageous last stand. It's one of those things where sometimes people die in war. But I made it purposeful, and I didn't kill him because he did something stupid, or that the enemy just did something that is just kind of out of left field. It just happened, and that is that's a loss. That's a setback for the team. But it didn't happen because they weren't doing the right things. Sometimes people die. I think that's really important too. If you're killing off important characters, to not just A, kill them because you want to kill them, Rick, but B, that doesn't all. I'm just kidding, but I think I kill more. Probably I kill more characters in my books than Rick does. But B, it doesn't have to be a courageous thing. It can just be that something bad happens and they die.
Well, and
I
that's
love my characters killing them.
I love my characters, but I also love killing them. Me.
No, I don't. I mean, I don't cry when they die, but I'm like, I do feel like a sense of like crap. I'm not gonna be able to write this character anymore because I have fun
For
with
sure.
it.
Yeah.
I was gonna say though, in contrast to the whole, I think it's possible to write a good story where the enemy is not that bright and yet still have tension. I was thinking specifically of when I write military science fiction, I like to look at history, real historical battles. And there's a battle that I think has incredible dramatic potential. It's never been made into a movie. It should have been. And that's the Battle of Kafji during the Gulf War. What happened was the Iraqis invaded a Saudi border town called Kafji, and it had been evacuated, so there was no civilians in there. But there was a team of Anglico Marines. I don't know if you know what Anglico is, but they're like fire observation, call for fire type people. Fire, I don't know what they call them in the Marines, but they don't use the term Anglico anymore. But basically, they call in air, naval, and artillery fire, and they were hiding in this city while the Iraqis looked for them in this evacuated city, and they were hiding in buildings while Iraqis like came up the stairs and never saw them, and they're calling fire from battleships off the coast because this is a coastal town, airstrikes and artillery on these Iraqis to try to keep themselves from being found the whole time. And they never did get found, and they kept the Iraqis from taking the city until the Saudi army came in and flushed them out.
I mean,
Wow, that's crazy. I'd never heard of that.
There's
and
a great book called Storm on the Horizon.
Storm on the Horizon.
That details the Battle of Kafji. It's really, really interesting story. Somebody should make a movie about it.
Hint, hint. I mean, as I'm thinking about the Iraqi Republican Guard in general, it's like maybe they're not stupid. They just have to express their intelligence in other ways. Like if you were going to survive in that military, you had to be incredibly good at manipulating, the hierarchy of what your position was, who you paid off, how who you're responsible for, what, all of your effort mentally is going into surviving within that environment. And they call it an army and they have, weapons and things like that. And now when it's called upon to act like an army, they don't have those skills, but they're very good at surviving in Saddam's government, because they're still alive. So that's something to think about as well, I think, is that, humans only have so much capacity. And if you're overwhelmed trying to protect yourself or protect your organization in one way, maybe you didn't have time to train to do the other things you need to do to be effective. I'm thinking like I just finished Team Yankee by Harold Coyle, and a few of my gripes about that. I enjoyed the book. It's very dry, but for when it was written, I think the first of its time, it was probably pretty cool to be able to see those things in a fictional perspective. But his portrayal of the Soviets, like I guess I'm used to Clancy showing Soviets as like kind of doing that same thing. Like they are effective within the bureaucratic organization that they have to survive in. His military leaders are trying to balance like selling stuff on the black market so they can make money while also maintaining their mission or getting supplies or things like that. Whereas Coyle they're all trying to survive. Like they have basically KGB officers in each unit that are putting pressure on the local commanders. And so the local commanders are making dumb decisions because the KGB is telling them to do it. And so they're all kind of bumbling around doing dumb things. And there's a big scene at the end of the book with a bridge where they're trying to like it's a retro action back across the bridge. And the KGB is rounding up people they think were deserting and shooting them. And so I think it was written to make a point about the Soviets and, what it was like to be a Soviet, but it wasn't super effective as like antagonists, so it didn't make the book as satisfying for me, but other parts of the book were great. But that was one thing where I wish the Soviets were smarter. Maybe they weren't actually, I don't know, but I would have liked to have seen that. So
well, that's the other thing is the philosophy of the army. Like in the Soviet army, it's a top-down army,
right.
Whereas the U.S. was a bottom-up one. The U.S., every private had to know the parts of the op order. And in case they were the last one alive, they had to be, you know, or the highest ranking one alive, they had to be able to carry out the mission. Soviets did not trust their foot soldiers to do that. And as a matter of fact, they barely trusted their NCOs to do that. They were an officer-run army. And you could make an argument that the United States was, I don't know if they still are, but they were an NCO-run army. And I think difference in philosophy is a good thing to include in your military science fiction, which I see two extremes in badly done military science fiction. One is the enemy is so alien you can't relate to them, and their decisions don't make sense, and they're just a horde of mindless monsters. And the other extreme, if they're just like the guys they're fighting, that you're fighting an army, it's just like yours, except they call themselves something different. But I like the idea of fighting an army that's like is different from your main character, as the U.S. Army was from the Imperial Japanese, or as the U.S. was from the Soviets, or from the Republican Guard, or say the to do something less U.S. centered, like the British were from the South Africans in the Boer War. You know, there's people with just different philosophies and different reasons for fighting. Like in Drop Trooper, I talked about the Tani were there basically for religious reasons. But I didn't just want to do a Great War on Terror, redux. I mean, what was it called? The Galaxy's Edge people already did that. I wanted to do like an army, a military we're facing that was based on historical militaries, but not like this is just the Japanese. That's why I kind of combined their whole government with Imperial Japan and dynastic Egypt. So I wanted something that people couldn't just put into a pigeonhole, and say, oh, this is a replacement for jihadis in the Middle East,
right,
or the Nazis in World War II. I want something different, and I think that I find those interesting, and I wish that more military science fiction writers wouldn't just take the easy way out and just make it. This is the Nazis. We're fighting space Nazis.
Watch out.
But again, though, that takes a lot of work, and I think that the best mil sci-fi books that I've read, some of them I don't know the authors, but a lot of them I do, and they put a lot of time and effort into, the world building, not just the tactics. I think one of the things that mil sci-fi, some of the shortcomings I've found is that a lot of them are just trying to do like tactical, like they want to get the tactics right, or they want to do a sci-fi version of Vietnam, but they forget all of the cool world building stuff that you can do with sci-fi, and like just really making that world unique and interesting and fun to read. Because we've talked about it before, the tactics are fun, the battles are fun, but there's so much more that goes into mil sci-fi than just the shooting laser beams or fighting aliens or whatever it is. And I think the truly great mil sci-fi books take all of it, science fiction and the military, and put it together so that you have a really awesome science fiction setting, and you have the military stuff that is correct and tactically sound, if you want to call it that. And you get kind of the best of both worlds, which I think for the most part, that's what mil sci-fi readers want. They want the best of both worlds. They want the cool science fiction gadgets and tech and all of that, but they also want really cool and interesting worlds to explore and see and just experience.
I want to visit exciting new places, meet interesting new people, and kill them with extreme prejudice.
100%, man. That's the whole point.
I'm trying to remember the old.
That should be our byline.
Right.
That should be our byline.
That's something else that bugs me, is when military science fiction writers don't take into account that new technology is going to require new ways of fighting and new tactics and basically a whole new organization of the military. Like if you have Starship Trooper style mobile infantry or, battle suits like an armor and drop trooper, what is cover for something like that?
Mm-hmm.
What is there cover? Is there any concealment? You're in a thing that's going to shine like a beacon on thermal. You're going to have like a nuclear reactor to power that thing. And you're going to have weapons that are high thermal signature. There's no hiding in those. And you see people try to make their battle suits, for example, like hide behind buildings or something. No, you're gonna shine like a star on any kind of, stuff we have now.
Right.
So you need to adjust, not just make your battle suits, World War II or Vietnam infantry who happen to be wearing battle suits. You have to think about what would the best defense be for something like that. And I chose mobility. They're constantly on the move. They don't sit still. You don't try to do a defensive position in a battle suit. It's only an offensive weapon. And that's just among the things that bug me, because I've seen that way too many times.
Mm-hmm.
Is they're just doing exactly what soldiers would have done 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
Yep.
And not taking into account the fact that they're living in a 200 or 300 years from now science fiction world with all this technology.
For sure.
So my biggest pet peeve, which as I've been thinking about it, and this is probably just because, I was both enlisted and officer, but I got to be a second lieutenant and a new platoon leader showing up, and the stereotype, of course, that we're all, dummies. But I just get really irritated by the stupid officer trope. I like well-meaning officers, even if they aren't. I want them to be well-intentioned, and I like their train. Like typically they are well-trained. It's just a matter of, did they pay attention, and are they like really focused on applying what they learned? I met plenty of dirtbag lieutenants, same as, fellow soldiers, but that's something that I like to see enlisted and officers working together. That's something I feel like the U.S. military does well. Like I'm actually I think about this a lot. Like, what's going to happen to that dichotomy going forward? Because it is based in, you know, hierarchies or whatever that we don't necessarily. They're becoming more blurred as time moves on, but they have different functions. An officer has a different function than an NCO, and one of the things when I applied for my ROTC scholarship, that this lieutenant colonel, I think he was trying to scare me, but I was a little private at the time. I had to do the interview while I was in basic training, and he looked at me. He was like, "Private, what do you think is the difference between an officer and an enlisted?" And I was like, I actually said this. I was like, "Sir, they get paid more." And he looks at me and he
Can
goes,
confirm.
"Yep." He looks at me and he goes, "No, only an officer can command." And I have thought about that. Like truly. I mean, I guess an NCO could certainly in the moment tell somebody to go take that hill, but an officer legally is only one that can command you to go take the hill as long as it's a legal order. But will that change?
Right.
And I like that to be well
I've
meaning.
always thought that the main function of an officer in the Army or the military is a crap collector, because crap rolls downhill.
Yeah,
And if you let that crap hit your NCOs,
right.
the ones who really make the Army work, then you lose all the good experienced NCOs. So the officer stands out front and stops the crap from hitting the important people.
I feel like that's management in general. If you're a kid, I mean, but that's something I learned in the Army, quite honestly.
Right.
Like, my role is to give them freedom, resources, direction, and freedom to perform the role that they need to do, and whatever I can do to protect them in that situation. But that's just a thing that bugs me, because I guess I feel like in today's Army, to a certain extent, like if you're just a dirtbag, you don't. Well, I shouldn't even say this, because I know plenty of people stayed in that I thought were dirtbags, so I shouldn't say that. When reading a story, I like to read about NCOs and officers working together, to accomplish a role. I don't like it when the officer being stupid is the source of tension in the story. That's the thing that that bugs me.
Oh, you're not gonna like Drop Trooper Book 4 then.
Oh well, I'll get past it.
Because there's, I mean, I feel like that you have the same percentage of dirtbags to good people in the military as you do anywhere else, and
Hmm.
some of them get to be officers. You know,
Well, I'm not
So
disagreeing. I'm just saying it's not
a lot of them get to be captains.
right. Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of them then, when the captains get out, stick around and become majors and lieutenant colonels. And one of the things like that cracked me up about Team Yankee, which is, written in 85, like there's so much dysfunctional abuse between the lieutenant colonel and the captain, and then the captain turns around and does it to the lieutenant. And I don't know if he did it on purpose, like the way he was showing that, but I mean, when I was in, that was just like a thing. Like you would just get screamed at by a lieutenant colonel. Like that was their purpose, was to yell at you and make you feel like garbage, which now I look back and I'm like, how is that an effective way to train anybody to do anything? But I don't know.
Right.
But anybody else
I
have like,
think
what are some other things as
no,
we,
but that was it. That was it for me.
I think that you brought up.
I
a
could
good
go
one.
off on a tangent, but I won't right now.
I think you brought up a good one with the whole officers and enlisted thing, though, or NCOs. That too many of them go off stereotypes and movie cliches when it comes to their NCOs and officers. I mean, the idea that they're all the lieutenants, get lost and are idiots, and all the NCOs are competent, and gruff. It doesn't always happen that way, and there's a lot of instances in history where it did not. So I'd like to
You
see
know what
a little bit of difference there.
this is the last thing I'll say. What I like is to see going against the tropes, but in a good way. And what I mean by that is in relation, and this can be any unit, but I'm just using special operations as kind of a baseline here because it's what we've talked about a lot. You see a lot of small tactics where the unit is skilled, but there's always a joker, or they're always like, they bicker back and forth, or they tell jokes, or all that, and that's 100% accurate. Like that happens in those units, and in all units, that kind of stuff happens. But my example here is Tears of the Sun, where it's the only only story that I can think of that the Special Forces unit, or in this case, Navy SEALs unit, were the picture portrait of consummate silent professionals through the entire movie. Like they were on a serious, and of course the theme of the movie doesn't fit with, kind of joking around, because they deal with some really kind of important and critical themes there. But and I've watched it several times. I'd watch it again. I could be wrong, but I know that there were one or two times where somebody made like a dry comment or a dry kind of humorous comment, but there was never a point where they were, like screwing with each other or joking with each other. There wasn't a unit clown or anything. They were all very serious and very keyed in and focused on what they were doing. And I would love to see more stories that kind of take that approach, where you have the trope of the smart guy or the clown or the tactically proficient guy, and they all kind of work together. I like seeing kind of a twist on that, where they're all just quiet, calm, competent professionals. Because I think you've done well, that could be really interesting.
that's kind of terrifying. I mean, that was one of my favorite things actually about the second Avatar movie, was when they were just showing, like they were like, they must have like played it off the Navy, right? Or it made me actually feel like watching the Air Force work, like when they're catching that whale and they're just so competent, and
Yeah.
they're applying what they're doing to, the application of violence toward a whale. But I don't know, they were just
Right.
so good at it. Like that sort of
Yep.
competence porn is fun to watch too sometimes.
Well, I think
For
that
sure.
if you look at like nonfiction told from the point of view of those special operations people, they are like quiet and confident and very businesslike when they're actually operating. But when you
Right.
see them out of the field, they are some of the most dark humored
Yeah.
MFers you've ever met.
No, I completely agree, 100%. It's 100% accurate.
I think that a good resource for anybody who wants to write military science fiction that's halfway realistic when it comes to the military organizations is current day nonfiction about recent events and things like Ukraine or the GWAT,
Mhm.
Iraq,
Yeah.
Afghanistan. You can get, I mean, you're going to have to change the technology and things like that. But when it comes to how people actually react and how they actually act in combat versus how they act when they're in their off time, you can get a lot of good sources of real people and how they really reacted to
story fodder.
oh
Right.
yeah, like just recently, this is a movie, not a book, but I just rewatched 13 Hours.
Oh, great movie.
And that's a great movie, and it shows you a lot of how these people react. Like in their off time, they're busting each other's balls and they're talking down their superiors and everything. But they go into combat and they're just acting like
professionals,
even though one guy's wearing like shorts.
Right. Yep.
There are way more first-person accounts of being a ranger in Afghanistan on Audible than I ever thought there were. I just went down the rabbit hole with Audible Plus, like kind of collecting things to listen to, and I can't name some off the top of my head right now, but I've filled up my to listen list with a whole bunch of ranger, like I think publishers must have been buying them for a little while because there were several to check out. And then David Petraeus, who I was deeply disappointed in for personal reasons, but he just came out with a book about like basically the history of warfare up to Ukraine called Conflict, which I'm pretty excited to listen to because as a general, I am interested in what he has to say. So there's there's so many good resources out there. What's that?
I said in general, I'm interested.
In general, I don't want to take his don't take his dating advice, but or his marriage counseling advice.
He's Eisenhower.
Yeah, I know. None of them were shining examples of marital fidelity. But
I mean,
anyway.
look at some of the most storied heroes in war. Most of them had pretty screwed up civilian lives once they got back.
Yeah.
So.
Or just kind of weirdos in general. But in general. All right. Well, I think we've reached our hour. So this has been good. I need to make a list so that I can not include these things in my next book. And I'll try not to hold them against anybody. But we can have another conversation about how to do it right. Take a thing and turn it on its head. So thanks very much for hanging out. Come hang out with us in the Discord. Tell us how much you love us. And we'll look forward to talking to you next time. So we'll see you all later.
Lone troopers on a hidden jump gate. Military Science Fiction Podcast. Discussion, interviews, reviews, and news. Military Science Fiction Podcast. Lone troop, it's time to hit the jump gate. Military Science Fiction Podcast. System on fire. Military science.